The Thalrux arrived like a shadow across the heavens, their massive ship a dark shape against the brilliance of the sun. It descended slowly as if time itself had bowed before their arrival. From every corner of Earth, humanity watched as the alien vessel took its place in orbit. The world held its breath, waiting for the next moment, for this was no ordinary event. This was not just the arrival of an alien species, but the defining moment of their entire existence in the galaxy. Their fate now rested in the hands of one being, the Thalrux ambassador Lyrax, who stood as the cold embodiment of their entire empire. Lyrax had been the one to witness the fall of countless civilizations that had failed to meet the Thalrux expectations. Many had sought to impress them with gifts of technology and wisdom, only to crumble beneath the weight of their own inadequacy. Humanity was no different. They too were a primitive species in the eyes of the Thalrux, their achievements laughable, their potential almost non-existent. To Lyrax, it was clear they would be no different than those who came before them, easily crushed beneath the might of the Thalrux empire. But there was one thing that stood in the way of this belief. The humans had sent a message of their own. It was not a message of defiance, nor a plea for mercy, but an invitation to prove themselves. Lyrax had been intrigued by the challenge, for it was one that had never been issued before. Humanity had something they wanted to show. They had no intention of bowing down or accepting extinction. They sought to prove their worthiness in their own way. Lyrax had been skeptical at first, but as the time for the summit grew near, even the ambassador could not deny the strange curiosity that began to form deep within the heart of the Thalrux representative. The challenge was set. Earth would prove its worth through a series of tests, and if humanity succeeded, they would gain a place in the galactic community. If they failed, their fate would be sealed, and they would be eradicated from the stars. But there was one catch. There would be no negotiation, no compromise. The tests would not be easy. They would be brutal and unforgiving, and each would be designed to push humanity to its very limits. Lyrax believed that no species could overcome such odds. They were too primitive, too fractured. Their technology could not compare to the might of the Thalrux, and yet something within the challenge sparked a sense of anticipation. Lyrax found themselves wondering what it was that made humans so determined despite their shortcomings. What was it that fueled them to reach beyond their grasp in a galaxy that seemed to offer them nothing but defeat? When the time came for the summit, humanity gathered their best and brightest minds to meet the Thalrux, with the knowledge that their lives, their future, depended on this meeting. The room was filled with tension. Even the air seemed thick with the weight of the unknown. And as the massive alien presence loomed before them, one thought crossed the minds of the gathered leaders of Earth. They would do whatever it took to prove that humanity was not just a species worth saving, but a species worth reckoning with. Lyrax stood before the assembled leaders of Earth, their eyes hidden behind the cool metallic mask that covered the ambassador's face. The hum of the alien ship reverberated through the air as if it were alive itself. It was the first time that the human representatives had been in the presence of such a being. Their minds raced as they tried to prepare for the moment that had been building for years. But in the face of the Thalrux, their minds went blank, and all that remained was the overwhelming presence of the alien race before them. Lyrax's voice broke the silence, its tone cold and unfeeling, as if every word carried the weight of eons of judgment. The tests would begin soon, and with them the fate of Earth would be sealed. It was not a threat, but a statement of fact. Humanity would be tested in ways they could not imagine. Their greatest strengths and their deepest flaws would be laid bare before the eyes of the Thalrux ambassador. Lyrax spoke with quiet confidence, believing that humanity was too fractured, too unrefined, to survive such an ordeal. The first test would be a combat trial, a simulated battle in space, designed to test both intellect and physical skill. Humanity's best pilots would face off against the advanced drones of the Thalrux in a contest of life and death. The scenario was set up to be impossible. No human ship could match the firepower or speed of the Thalrux drones. But Lurax had underestimated something fundamental about humanity. Their ability to defy the odds when everything seemed lost. Humanity had a way of reaching beyond the impossible with a reckless sort of brilliance, something that the Thalrux had not anticipated. When the time came for the selection of the pilot, the leaders of Earth did not hesitate. They knew who was the only one capable of facing this challenge. The name echoed through the room like a pulse: Captain Jack Calloway. The man who had built a reputation on breaking every rule, every regulation, and surviving against all odds. A man who seemed to thrive when everything was stacked against him. Calloway was not a hero. He was not a starfighter or a symbol of hope. He was a man who could see patterns where others saw chaos. And in the face of the impossible, he had a habit of doing the unexpected. His selection was met with both shock and relief. The humans had placed their faith in the hands of a man who had nothing to lose. Calloway was not the best pilot. He was simply the one most willing to sacrifice everything for victory. And that was the kind of man who could outsmart the Thalrux. But even as the humans placed their trust in him, Lurax remained unmoved. The ambassador's mind was already made up. Humanity would fail, just as every other species had before them. The test was set, and the game was about to begin. But what Lurax did not know was that Calloway's plan was already in motion, and the Thalrux would soon learn that underestimating humanity can be their biggest mistake yet. As Calloway climbed into his spacecraft, the weight of the moment pressed down on him. It wasn't the size of the ship or the advanced tech he would face that concerned him. It was the eyes of the world upon him. Every move he made would be scrutinized, and every mistake would carry the weight of humanity's survival. But if there was one thing Calloway had learned over the years, it was to never let the pressure break him. He was used to being underestimated, used to people thinking he was a wild card, someone who couldn't follow orders or stick to the plan. But that was exactly why he was the right man for the job. The simulation began as soon as the ship lifted off the ground, the hum of the engines vibrating through his bones. As he ascended into the cold vastness of space above Earth's atmosphere, the stars stretched out before him, a cold and distant sea. As the Thalrux drones took their positions in the distance, their sleek metallic bodies glinting in the light of distant stars, Calloway's mind raced. The situation was dire. The drones were faster, more maneuverable, and their weapons were far superior. But he had something they didn't: the ability to think outside the box. The drones engaged immediately, unleashing a barrage of fire that cut through the darkness around him. Calloway's hands moved instinctively, guiding the ship through tight, evasive maneuvers, twisting and turning with a skill that seemed impossible for a ship so outdated and underpowered. The drones fired relentlessly, but every blast missed by a fraction as Calloway pushed the limits of his craft. Knowing that each second he survived was a victory in itself, he could hear the Thalrux voice in his mind, their expectations cold and final. This would be over soon, they thought, but Calloway refused to surrender. As the first drone closed in, he twisted the controls, sharply sending the ship into a spiraling dive. The drone followed, but miscalculated its trajectory, slamming into a nearby asteroid with a massive explosion. The first victory. Calloway allowed himself a brief smile before refocusing on the remaining drones. He could feel the sting of the human pride beneath him. They would not be defeated so easily. The next round of drones came at him in formation, their weapons trained and ready. This time they didn't miss. But Calloway was ready. He dove headfirst into the incoming fire, his ship twisting and contorting in impossible angles. As he shot toward the heart of the formation, the drones fired, but his ship duped and swerved, dodging each shot with inches to spare. The distance between them closed. As he reached the center of the swarm, his mind focused only on the next move. He had no backup, no reinforcements, just the sharpness of his instincts and the desperation to survive. He fired back, but instead of aiming directly at the drones, he aimed at the surrounding environment. He targeted the larger asteroids and sent them tumbling through space to collide with the drones. The rocks were slower, but far more unpredictable. As they careened toward the enemy, the drones scattered, but in their confusion, Calloway picked them off. One by one, the second drone exploded in a flash of light. The third was taken out by a rock before it even had time to react. Soon, there were only a few drones left, and Lurax watched from afar, eyes narrowing as the human pilot defied everything he thought he knew about strategy and survival. Calloway could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins as he pushed his ship to its limits. The remaining drones circled around him like vultures waiting for a mistake. They were faster now, their tactics more refined. But Calloway wasn't done, yet he wasn't going to let these machines dictate the end of humanity's future. Every move he made was calculated, every breath taken was a decision. He focused on the drones and their movements, studying them like a chessboard, trying to predict their next strike. But he knew it was more than that. This wasn't just about survival, it was about sending a message to Lurax and to the Tharux. Humanity had something they didn't have. And it wasn't just their technology, it was their will to survive. The drones moved in formation this time, their weapons locked on Calloway's ship. But he had anticipated this, he had been waiting for this moment. As the drones fired their weapons, he dove downward into the depths of a nearby asteroid field, pulling his ship into tight, weaving turns through the massive rocks that drifted like floating giants in the cold expanse of space. The drones followed in hot pursuit, but they couldn't match the chaos of the field. Their movements became erratic as they struggled to keep up with Calloway's unpredictable path. Every twist and turn was a gamble, but it was the only chance he had, and he was willing to take it. The first drone collided with an asteroid, its weapon fire going wild as it crashed into the rock face, its explosion illuminating the darkness. For a brief moment, Calloway didn't look back. His eyes were fixed ahead, searching for the next move. He could feel the sweat on his brow, the weight of every decision bearing down on him. But the drones were still coming. They were relentless, and they had the advantage in terms of speed and firepower. Calloway pushed on, knowing that one mistake could cost him everything. As the final two drones closed in on him, Calloway made his move. He triggered the ship's afterburners and shot toward an asteroid far ahead of the remaining drones, pulling the ship into a hard vertical climb. The drones followed, but Calloway's trajectory was too sharp for them to replicate. The drones clipped each other as they tried to change course. Too late, the ships collided and exploded in a blinding flash of light. The shockwave sent Calloway's ship spinning out of control. His hands gripped the controls with everything he had to stabilize the craft. The ship groaned in protest, but it held together. Calloway's heart pounded in his chest as he regained control over his ship. The final two drones were gone, and the simulation was over. The silence that followed was deafening. The Tharux ambassador Lurax watched in stunned disbelief, their mind racing as the human pilots stood victorious in a battle that should have been impossible. The drones, the perfect machines of war, had been outwitted by a single human pilot in a ship that was barely holding together. The impossible had happened. Humanity had won. The screen flickered as the last drone disintegrated in a brilliant explosion. The silence that followed seemed to stretch on forever, like the calm before a storm. Calloway's hands trembled slightly as he eased the controls of his battered ship back into a steady glide toward the designated landing area, his breath slow and measured. But his mind was racing. He had done it. He had defied the odds and survived. But the reality of what had just happened began to settle over him. The impossible had been achieved. But what came next, no one knew. As the human pilot set his ship down with a rough but controlled landing, Lurax's eyes narrowed from across the chamber. The Tharux ambassador stood motionless, their expression unreadable. But the mind behind that gaze was whirling with confusion and something else, something alien to the ambassador, a creeping sense of doubt. Calloway's ship was far from pristine. It was barely functional, a relic compared to the machines the Tharux used. Yet the human pilot had triumphed where thousands of other species had failed. The victory was unexpected, but it was undeniable. The human pilot had outsmarted their most advanced drones with nothing but raw skill and a deep understanding of his surroundings. And it was that realization that began to gnaw at Lurax's confidence. The ambassador had witnessed civilizations fall without hesitation before, but never like this. The Tharux were known for their superior technology, their perfect machines designed for combat, yet it was a flawed human ship, piloted by a man who had once been written off as reckless, that had achieved what no one else could. It was not just a victory of skill, it was a victory of spirit, of the human resolve that refused to bend under pressure. Lurax's mind grappled with the implications. Humanity was supposed to be weak, primitive, But now the ambassador was forced to reconsider the narrative they had believed so firmly in for centuries. Humans had survived by their ability to adapt, their creativity, their unpredictability. They were a species that didn't simply accept the odds, but faced them with something more profound, something that technology could never replicate. As the simulation ended, and the room remained filled with stunned silence, the Thalrux delegation exchanged quick glances, none of them daring to speak. But Lyrax knew that this moment would be remembered as a turning point, one that could never be erased. The ambassador turned slowly, their gaze still fixed on Calloway, the human who had shattered expectations. The pilot was now stepping out of the wreckage of his ship and looking up at the gathered leaders and the Thalrux officials. His face was flushed with the thrill of victory, but there was a certain quietness in his eyes, as though he understood the magnitude of what had just transpired. He had done what no one thought possible, but he also knew the path forward was uncertain. He had won a battle, but the war for humanity's place in the galaxy had just begun. And as Lyrax watched the human pilot stand there accepting his victory in silence, the ambassador realized that humanity had something the Thalrux could never predict: the human ability to surprise, to adapt, and to persevere against all odds. The challenge had only just begun, and the Thalrux were not prepared for what was to come next. Lyrax remained frozen for a long moment, the silence in the chamber so thick it felt like it could crush the air out of the room. Every gaze was fixed on Calloway as he stood tall in the midst of the wreckage of his ship. There was no fanfare, no celebration, just a quiet understanding that something monumental had occurred. The weight of humanity's survival now rested on the shoulders of this one man. But the implications of the victory were far beyond what anyone had expected. The Thalrux ambassador's mind spun as they struggled to reconcile what they had just witnessed. Everything they knew about warfare had been turned on its head. The Thalrux drones were the finest creations in the galaxy. They were built for speed, precision, and dominance. No civilization had ever managed to defeat them, much less outwit them. Yet here was a human with a ship that was barely more than scrap metal, who had done what none of the galaxy's finest warriors could even dream of achieving. Calloway had not just defeated their technology, he had outsmarted it, outmaneuvered it, with nothing but the chaos of his surroundings and the raw instinct that the Thalrux could never have anticipated. The ambassador's mind continued to race. There was a deep and unfamiliar sense of unease that crept into Lyrax's thoughts. How had a species so seemingly inferior managed to prove themselves so capable? Were the Thalrux wrong about humanity's potential all this time? Could this one human pilot be a reflection of the larger truth about humanity, something that had eluded the Thalrux for so long? The answer seemed almost impossible to grasp, but there was no denying the truth that was staring Lyrax in the face. Humanity had fought back against the odds, and won in a way that no one had ever expected. The ambassador took a slow, deliberate breath before speaking. Their voice was still calm, but it was laced with an undercurrent of something different, something like respect. Though Lyrax would never admit it aloud, the words came out quieter than they intended. "You have done what none of us believed possible," the Thalrux ambassador said, their gaze still locked onto Calloway. "You have proven yourselves more than capable of surviving a challenge that no one else could overcome." There was no malice in Lyrax's words, no anger, just a kind of reluctant acknowledgement that this was a turning point, a moment that could never be undone. Calloway met their gaze head on, his expression unreadable, but in his eyes was something that Lyrax had not seen in the other humans, a fire, something fierce and unyielding, the kind of determination that could reshape worlds. "I didn't do this alone," Calloway said, his voice steady but laced with the quiet conviction of a man who knew what was at stake. "It wasn't just me, it was every person back on Earth fighting to survive, making sure that we could still stand up when everything is against us. The humans have been through worse, and yet we are still here." He paused, looking around at the Thalrux delegation, his gaze unflinching. "And now you know what we're capable of." The ambassador could feel a slight shift in the air, the room heavy with the weight of the unspoken words. It was as though the very fabric of the encounter had changed, as if the tables had been turned from that moment on. The Thalrux had not been the ones holding the power. The humans had asserted themselves in ways that no one could have predicted. Lyrax's thoughts lingered on Calloway's words. Humanity's ability to endure, their resilience in the face of adversity, had always been underestimated by every race they had encountered. but it was becoming impossible to ignore now. Calloway had not simply proven that humanity could fight back. He had shown that they would never give up, that they would always find a way forward, no matter the odds, and that was something no machine could account for. In the quiet that followed, the Thalrux ambassador turned to their delegation, their gaze calculating and sharp. Their decision was not a simple one. It could not be decided in a moment of reaction. It would need careful consideration. But there was no denying the truth. Humanity had just proven their worth in a way that was irrefutable. This battle had been won. But the real test was just beginning. Calloway's victory had already set the stage for something far larger than either side could fully comprehend. Lorax stood in silence, staring at the human pilot who had defied all expectations. The Thalrux ambassador could feel the weight of the moment pressing in around them. There was no turning back now. This was no longer just about the humans proving themselves in combat. It was about understanding them in ways no one ever had before. The Thalrux had always seen themselves as the pinnacle of evolution, that empire built on the foundation of technological superiority and cold logic. They had never needed to ask questions about the species they encountered, only whether they were strong enough to join the Galactic Order, or whether they were destined to be eradicated for their weakness. But the humans had shown them something different, something profound: the power of their spirit, the raw drive to survive, to adapt to the impossible, to learn and grow from every challenge faced. It was not something that could be measured by weapons or technology. It was a force that transcended the Thalrux understanding of what made a species worthy. A human ability to persevere had revealed itself in ways that no machine could replicate. The ambassador had no choice but to confront this new truth. There was something more to humanity than met the eye, something they had missed in their assessment. And now Lorax found themselves at a crossroads, torn between the rigid beliefs that had guided the Thalrux for eons, and the new reality that humanity had presented. The human pilot Calloway had become a symbol of that reality, a living testament to the resilience that seemed to pulse through the heart of the human race. But as much as Lorax was forced to reconsider their beliefs about humanity, they still had their duty to the Thalrux Empire and their people. They could not simply let one victory cloud their judgment. The ambassador had seen countless civilizations rise and fall with equal speed. They knew that just because one human pilot had won a battle, it did not guarantee their worth in the larger galactic picture. The tests had only just begun, and the challenges ahead would be far greater than anything Calloway had faced in the simulation. Still, Lorax could not shake the feeling that humanity was different, that they had something more than the other species who had failed the Thalrux test, something that could not be quantified in weapons or technology, something intangible, something that felt like it could change the future of the galaxy. The thought lingered in Lorax's mind, but it was not enough to sway them entirely. Not yet. Lorax turned their attention back to Calloway, who stood quietly among the gathered leaders, his eyes calm but focused. There was no arrogance in his demeanor, no celebration of his victory. He simply stood there waiting for the next step. The Thalrux ambassador regarded the human pilot for a moment longer before addressing the room. Calloway's performance has been remarkable. Lorax began, their voice steady, but with a subtle edge to it. We did not expect such results, and for that you have proven yourselves capable of facing challenges that no one could have predicted. But do not mistake this for an end. We have only just begun our trials. If humanity wishes to stand among the stars, you must prove more than just your ability to fight. You must prove your worth in ways beyond battle, ways that will test the very core of your species. Lorax paused, scanning the humans in the room. The challenge before them was unlike any they had faced before. There was no turning back now. The future of their species was in their hands. The challenge would be unforgiving, and the path ahead would be fraught with obstacles. But as the ambassadors spoke these words, they could not shake the nagging sense that humanity had already begun to prove something that was far more important than mere survival. They had shown their potential to rise to the occasion, to evolve when pushed to the edge. And that was something the Thalrux had never seen before in any species. Perhaps this was the true test, something more profound than mere strength or intelligence, the ability to adapt and change, to face the unknown and continue moving forward. Perhaps that was the real measure of worth. And if that was true, humanity had already passed the first test. Now it was up to the rest of the galaxy to see what they would do next. The room was still as Lurax finished speaking their words, hanging in the air like a heavy fog. The challenge was laid out for humanity, but it was clear that the ambassador's words held more weight than just the formal declaration of the next test. Something deeper lingered behind them, a subtle shift in the tone that only those present could sense. Even Calloway could feel it. Though he didn't show it, the Thalrux had underestimated humanity, but now they were cautiously considering something more than just a quick judgment. A consideration that seemed to have been sparked by Calloway's unexpected victory. The human pilot stood still as the Thalrux ambassador's gaze lingered on him. It was a silent acknowledgement, a realization that humanity was no longer a species to be written off. They had something that no other race had anticipated, an indomitable will to fight and to survive that could not be quantified or predicted by even the most advanced technology. Humanity had shown that they were not just going to follow the patterns laid out for them. They were capable of defying the odds and shaping their own destiny. But despite the growing recognition of humanity's potential, the reality of the situation was undeniable. The trials had only just begun, and Calloway's victory was only a small part of the larger picture. The challenges ahead would be far more brutal and complex than the combat simulation that had just been completed. There was still so much to prove to the Thalrux. There were many more hurdles to overcome, and the path forward would not be easy, not by any means. The ambassador's gaze shifted from Calloway to the other human leaders who stood in the room watching the exchange. Some of them looked hopeful, others were nervous, unsure of what was to come next. But there was no turning back now. The Thalrux had set the rules and humanity had accepted them. They had shown their worth in battle, but that alone would not guarantee their place in the galaxy. The tests would continue, and each one would be more unforgiving than the last. Calloway knew that better than anyone. His victory hadn't won humanity the war, it had simply bought them time to prove that they were more than just survivors, more than just a species clinging to life in the hope that someone might take pity on them. The true challenge was still ahead, and this time the stakes would be far higher than a single pilot's life. The future of Earth was at risk. Calloway glanced around at the other human leaders and saw the determination in their eyes. He could sense the weight of the responsibility that had shifted onto their shoulders. But they weren't about to back down. This wasn't about one man or one victory. This was about proving that humanity had something worth fighting for, something that the Thalrux could never take away, something that transcended technology or weapons or any of the tools that the galactic powers prized so highly. This was about showing that humanity's value wasn't just in what they could create, but in what they could become. The Thalrux might have seen humanity as just another fleeting species on the edge of the galaxy, but Calloway and the others knew differently. Humanity had something that couldn't be measured by any standard the Thalrux used. It wasn't just about surviving the trials, it was about shaping the future of the galaxy and proving that humanity had earned their place in it. Lurax turned their gaze away from the humans, their mind still swirling with the implications of the events that had unfolded. This was not the outcome they had expected. This was not a simple test of strength or intelligence. This was something deeper, something that the ambassador had never accounted for in the calculations of galactic power. The Thalrux had always valued power over everything, but now they were being forced to consider something else, something that spoke to the very core of existence, the ability to endure and adapt, to rise up in the face of impossible odds, and to fight not for victory, but for survival itself. The ambassador's eyes flickered with uncertainty for a brief moment before they spoke again. Humanity has shown something we did not expect, Lurax said, their voice calm, but edged with something new, something less certain. We will proceed with the next phase of the trials, but know this: the path ahead will be harder than any you have faced thus far, and there will be no mercy, but you have proven that you are worthy of this challenge, and perhaps worthy of what lies beyond it. Calloway met the ambassador's eyes for a moment, his expression still unreadable. But in that brief exchange, something passed between them, an understanding, something that neither of them had expected. It wasn't just about the trial or the outcome anymore. It was about what was to come next. The future of humanity's place in the galaxy was still uncertain, but one thing was clear: the Thalrux had underestimated them, and now they would have to face the consequences of that mistake. The room seemed to pulse with an unspoken tension as Lorax's words hung in the air. Humanity had proven their worth, but what came next was still a mystery. The trials had only just begun, but now they had been irrevocably changed. The Tharux delegation stood still, processing the new reality. They were facing a species that had shattered expectations with nothing more than determination and ingenuity, something that the Tharux had never considered to be a threat until now. Calloway stood at the center of it all, his heart still racing from the combat simulation. But his mind was already turning toward the future. He knew that his victory was only a small step in a much larger journey. The road ahead would be filled with challenges even greater than the one he had just faced. And there was no guarantee that humanity would survive it. But for the first time since the arrival of the Tharux, he felt a sense of something he hadn't experienced before. Hope. Humanity had always been at the mercy of stronger forces that saw them as insignificant at best and expendable at worst. But today they had taken a stand and proven that they were not just survivors, they were fighters. They were capable of adapting to the impossible and overcoming it. And that was something the Tharux could not ignore. As Calloway met Lorax's gaze again, he saw something flicker in the ambassador's eyes, something almost like respect. It was a fleeting moment, but it was there. The Tharux had always believed that the future of the galaxy would be shaped by the strongest of the strong, those who could wield the most advanced technology and dominate their foes. But humanity had proven that there was more to strength than just weapons or machines. There was a fire within them that could not be extinguished, no matter the odds, no matter the challenges. And now the Tharux had to decide whether they would continue to view humanity as just another obstacle to be crushed, or whether they would acknowledge the raw power of human resilience and adaptability. Lorax turned their attention back to the assembly of human leaders who were watching the exchange closely. They could sense that the Tharux were reevaluating their stance on humanity. But the true test was yet to come, and Lorax's next words would decide the direction of the trials ahead. The ambassador took a slow breath, their voice calm but firm. "We will proceed with the trials as planned, but know this: the challenges will grow more difficult with each stage. You have proven you are worthy of the next phase. But whether you can endure the trials that await remains to be seen. You have only just begun to show us what you are capable of." Lorax's gaze shifted briefly to the rest of the Tharux delegation, their silence hanging over the room like a shadow. They knew what this moment meant. The decision to acknowledge humanity's potential was not an easy one. It was a risk, one that could have unforeseen consequences. But Lorax had been forced to acknowledge that humanity was not like any species they had encountered before. They were unpredictable, yes, but they were also brilliant. They could adapt and thrive in situations where others would simply crumble, and that made them dangerous in ways the Tharux had never anticipated. But it also made them worthy of something more than conquest. They were worthy of a place among the stars. Calloway knew that the real battle was only beginning. And as he stood there facing Lorax, he felt the weight of the moment settle onto him. It wasn't just about proving humanity's worth anymore. It was about ensuring that they didn't lose sight of what they had fought for, ensuring that humanity's future would not be dictated by the will of the Tharux or any other alien race. The next steps would be difficult, but Calloway was ready. He had proven that humanity could fight when pushed to the brink. But now they had to prove that they could stand together and build something greater than what had come before, something that would ensure their survival in a galaxy that had once seen them as weak. Now humanity would have to prove that they could thrive among the stars, and if they were successful, it would change the fate of the entire galaxy. The trials would continue, but humanity had already begun to show that they would not back down. They would fight to the end, and in doing so they would forge their own destiny, no matter the cost.